65 men, one open deck, salt in the air, wool against skin, the steady slap of oars, smoke curling from a small hearth. There is no privacy, no enclosed latrine, no running water, only wind and sea, and a wooden ship that breathes. Yet these crews crossed the North Sea, settled Iceland and Greenland, and even touched North America. How did they avoid the kind of fast-moving, ship-ending epidemics that would later devastate enclosed navies? The short answer: not through germ theory, not through modern sanitation, but through three overlapping practical strategies: design choices that prevented buildup, a rhythm of beaching that let land do the dirty work, and cultural routines and provisioning that removed vectors and contaminated water. Taken together, these created an operational hygiene that let crews stay functional even without what we call modern hygiene. If you love deep history explainers like this, subscribe. To understand how this worked, imagine the Longship itself. A typical warship might be 40 to 70 feet long, narrow, with a low freeboard, so low that waves frequently washed across the deck. Crew density was high, dozens of men shoulder to shoulder, sharing benches and breath. Longships were built with overlapping planks, or clinker construction, giving a hull that flexed and leaked slightly, a feature, not a flaw, for seafaring in rough northern waters. They carried few of the bulky amenities that later vessels assumed as permanent fixtures. Their missions varied: coastal raiding, trading, seasonal migration, but the constant was mobility and the ability to land almost anywhere. This combination of form and function is central to the paradox. Cramped, exposed crews, but fewer catastrophic outbreaks than might be expected. Archaeological and textual evidence points to three complementary strategies that address different parts of the contagion problem. First, architectural minimalism. Ships were designed to avoid the accumulation and containment of human waste. Second, frequent beaching. The ability to land everywhere turned the shore into the main site of washing, disposal, and reset. Third, cultural and provisioning habits. Daily grooming, regular bathing, and fermented or boiled liquids reduced vectors and waterborne threats. Each strategy has its own evidence. Together they form a plausible explanation for how Vikings managed disease risk at sea. Archaeology raises the first piece of the puzzle. Excavations such as Oseberg and Gogstad, and surveys at Hedeby, Hedeby-Wyme, reveal a striking absence. No fixed-built latrines were found on longships. The grave ships at Oseberg and Gogstad, richly furnished burial vessels preserved by peat and sand, contained combs, buckets, cooking gear, and other everyday objects, but not the kind of molded or carved latrine structures one finds on later, more settled ships. Shore sites and settlements show middens, refuse heaps, full of bones and domestic detritus, and in those contexts, archaeologists find evidence of disposal and processing, not onboard containment. Textual sources reinforce aspects of these finds. Observers such as Ahmad ibn Fadlan, traveling among northern peoples in the 10th century, recorded detailed descriptions of bathing, grooming, and daily habits among the Rus, accounts that, while partial and culturally filtered, point to practices of frequent washing and combing. Later medieval chroniclers, including John of Wallingford, also remark on the grooming and cleanliness rituals of northern sailors and settlers. These narratives do not tell us everything, and scholars caution against reading them as scientific manuals. Still, they offer an important human-scale window that complements the material record. Combs, bowls, and grooming tools recovered from graves and settlements show that care of the body was a routine part of life. Now consider the first strategy: architectural minimalism and immediate overboard dispersal. The Longship's low freeboard made it trivial for crew to dispose of human waste directly into the sea. There were no sealed tanks, no deep bilges where sewage could accumulate and stagnate. The clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks nailed together, were intentionally flexible and, in practice, slightly leaky. That leakage, paired with regular bailing by the crew, prevented the formation of stagnant pockets of water inside the ship. Where later ships sealed themselves and created dark, enclosed bilges that trapped filth and bacteria, longships relied on constant exchange with the surrounding water. What does this mean in practical terms? Pathogens that depend on concentrated, stationary reservoirs, think of bacteria multiplying in stored fresh water, or fecal contamination collecting in an enclosed bilge, find fewer opportunities to amplify on a vessel where waste is immediately dispersed into moving salt water. The ocean acts, in effect, as a diluting and flushing agent. Moving water disperses organic material quickly. Saltwater chemistry is hostile to some freshwater pathogens, and waves and currents reduce the local concentration of contaminants. That does not mean the sea is a sanitizing miracle. Dumping waste overboard simply shifts contamination into the environment. But for the objective of keeping a crew operational at sea, preventing rapid ship-wide collapse from a concentrated outbreak, immediate dispersal and an open, flushed hull were likely effective strategies. Even with frequent overboard disposal, ships face a host of other risks: lice, skin infections, contaminated water supplies, foul clothing. This is where the second strategy, frequent beaching and a culture of reset, becomes crucial. Longships were built with a shallow draft and a flexible hull, enabling them to land on beaches, riverbanks, and shallow estuaries. Archaeologists and historians point to a dense network of temporary harbors and landing sites along the North Atlantic coasts, places to careen a ship, to offload cargo, and to offboard people for chores. Seasonal bases, wintering harbors like the Torquay Winter Base, noted in some surveys, and the many small coves along Scandinavian and British shores created a geography of reset. When a crew could land every few days, or even nightly in some coastal operations, it could shift activities that would otherwise be dangerous aboard onto the land. Washing, laundering, skinning hides, gutting fish, and disposing of human waste became shore-based tasks. Soiled clothing could be shaken out on rocks or patched near a hearth. Bedding could be aired, and combs and brushes could be used in private. The shore provided absorbent soils and microbial processes that break down organic waste more efficiently than a small enclosed shipboard environment could. In archaeological terms, decades of midden deposits and increased concentrations of parasite eggs or organic refuse near landing sites testify to this repeated shore-based activity, an environmental cost that archaeological science can now detect. This beaching rhythm also had an important social dimension. It structured daily life. A ship's routine was not continuous confinement, but a cycle of sea time and shore time. Even in reconnaissance or raiding missions, crews alternated rowing or sailing with periods ashore, and that alternation itself functions as a public health mechanism. If one man became seriously ill, the shore could serve as a place to isolate him, to tend wounds, or to burn contaminated materials. The ability to land almost anywhere removed the need to carry bulky stores of fresh water, or to rely on enclosed shipboard spaces for sanitation. Which brings us to the third strategy: cultural hygiene and provisioning practices that suppress disease vectors and reduce the risk of waterborne infections. Archaeological graves routinely contain combs, sometimes dozens, suggesting that daily grooming was not an occasional convenience, but a cultural norm. Textual witnesses like Ibn Fadlan describe people washing, combing, and tending their bodies with care. Scholars suggest that these grooming routines, daily combing, tending hair and lice, cleaning bedding, functioned as a community-level vector control measure. Lice and other ectoparasites thrive where hair and clothing go unkempt. Removing them limits opportunities for infection and irritation, and in small, close-quarters groups, this can make a significant difference in daily health and morale. Provisioning choices further shifted the balance away from waterborne disease. Fresh water is heavy, and long voyages without reliable resupply place a premium on storage. Where later navies sometimes relied on stored static freshwater, stored in barrels vulnerable to contamination, Viking crews often supplemented or replaced fresh water with boiled or fermented drinks. Weak beer and soured milk, or skyer, fermented dairy, were common aboard. Fermentation and boiling kill or reduce many pathogens that would otherwise thrive in stagnant water. Archaeological and chemical analyses of residues in containers suggest widespread use of fermented beverages. Textual sources indicate that boiling and fermentation were routine, and scholars point out the practical logic. A weak beer or soured milk is calorically dense, less likely to spoil in a way that makes people ill, and safer than unboiled surface water. The combined effect of these provisioning choices and grooming rituals was to reduce two major categories of shipboard illness: vector-borne nuisance conditions, lice, ticks, skin infections, and waterborne bacterial outbreaks that require concentrated contaminated reservoirs to explode into epidemics. It is important to be precise. This system did not produce perfect health. Archaeological studies of settlement middens and soil cores show eggs of helminths and other intestinal parasites in and around coastal sites, indicating ongoing endemic parasitism. Dental disease, chronic joint problems, scurvy in certain contexts, and localized infections are part of the human record. But where later, enclosed navies experienced sudden catastrophic outbreaks, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, Viking operational practices likely prevented the conditions that allow those pathogens to amplify quickly on board. A useful comparison is with 19th century naval experience. Ships like HMS Thunderer in the mid-1800s sailed with sealed freshwater stores and deep, enclosed bilges. Those designs had advantages for prolonged sea time, but the combination of long-term water storage and enclosed, stagnant spaces created conditions that allowed waterborne illnesses to sweep through crews once contamination occurred. Cholera and typhoid outbreaks on such ships could be devastating precisely because pathogens had reservoirs in which to multiply and spread. The Viking approach, relying on dilution, flushing, and shore resets, traded the long-range endurance of later navies for an operational system that minimized rapid collapse from disease. Archaeology and biological science bring further nuance. Studies of latrine pits and midden layers near landing sites show concentrations of parasite eggs and bacterial residues that suggest shore contamination was real and locally significant. Geochemical surveys and sediment cores from some harbor sites show changes consistent with heavy, repeated deposition of organic waste in the medieval period. In plain terms, the shore bore the environmental costs of shipboard sanitation. Where the ship was a place of mobility and flushing, the settlements and landing spots accumulated refuse and, over time, higher parasite loads. We should also emphasize the limits at the individual level. Crew members still suffered from chronic ailments, infected wounds, dental abscesses, respiratory problems from smoke inhalation, and the persistent discomfort of lice and fleas. Seasonal and endemic diseases were common. The Viking system diminished the chance of large, fleet-ending epidemics that moved quickly through closely packed men in sealed quarters, but it did not eliminate disease. Archaeologists have found osteological markers of infections and malnutrition in skeletal remains associated with Viking contexts, and studies of coprolites and soil samples reveal helminth burdens. Scholars are careful to frame the evidence. Archaeological data indicate probable reductions in certain types of epidemic risk, not universal immunity or perfection. Why, then, does the story matter beyond historical curiosity? It matters because it demonstrates how engineering, geography, and culture can be woven into an effective, if imperfect, public health strategy. The Longships design removed the structural possibility of certain problems. Without enclosed latrines or sealed water tanks, you remove the reservoir that allows certain pathogens to amplify. The crew's routines, daily grooming, regular washing when ashore, preparing fermented or boiled liquids, reduced vectors, and contaminated consumption. The geography of landing sites let the landscape do the heavy lifting of decay and absorption. Where later medical approaches often focused on treating consequences once they arose, the Viking approach was preventive in the most literal sense. Design out the conditions that allowed disease to scale. This is not to romanticize or to suggest that environmental dumping was harmless. The archaeological record shows that shore sites carried a higher burden of organic waste and parasites. Middens accumulate. Parasite eggs persist in soils. Localized contamination affects future inhabitants. Vikings traded one set of risks for another, less chance of an onboard epidemic at the cost of concentrated impacts on landing sites and nearby settlements. That trade-off is ethically complex and deserves acknowledgement. Ancient seafaring solved one problem by shifting consequences onto different landscapes and communities. It is also worth clarifying what the Vikings did not have. They did not operate with an understanding of microbial agents or germ theory. They were not immunologists or microbiologists. Their measures were pragmatic and ritualized, habitual practices grounded in experience and social norms rather than in laboratory knowledge. Scholars stress that any explanation should avoid retrofitting modern intelligence onto past actors. What matters is outcome. Their combination of ship design, sea-land mobility, and cultural practices produced a pattern of resilience in seafaring operations. To make this more concrete, picture a typical voyage. The ship launches from a rocky cove at dawn. Men row in sync. The deck gets splashed repeatedly. During the day, someone relieves themselves over the gunwale. The waves take the waste, dispersing it quickly. Combs are used each morning. Bedding is aired when the ship beaches each night. At a sheltered estuary, the crew beach the ship, strip off stiffened clothing, and boil a cauldron of weak beer or heat-soured milk. While the ship is drawn up and careened, they launder garments, patch sails, and throw trash into the midden outside the immediate living area. If a man develops a deep wound, he can be tended ashore, away from the cramped benches and smoky deck. Small ailments fester, but they rarely sweep unchecked through an entire crew in a way that ends a voyage. Historical successes, reaching Iceland, settling Greenland, and voyages to Vinland, were not solely the product of health measures. Navigation, seamanship, warfare, and sheer brutality of weather mattered as well. But the ability to keep a ship full of men functional for weeks at sea was a necessary condition for exploration and expansion. The three-pronged approach made that possible in practical terms. As we close, return to that opening image. 65 men breathing the same salt-scented air, leaning on oars, trusting a wooden hull that leaks just enough to let the sea itself be a flushing system. They were far from healthy by modern standards. Infected teeth, parasite burdens, and chronic ailments persisted, but they were operational. They prevented catastrophic outbreaks, not by knowing microbes, but by designing constraints into their ships and routines, so the conditions for rapid epidemic spread rarely arose. The ocean served as both workplace and waste removal mechanism. The shore was a repeated reset button, and daily cultural habits kept vectors in check. Today, the lesson is not that ancient practices are superior to modern sanitation. It is that public health resilience can come from design choices and social rhythms, an old principle applied in a very specific maritime context. The Vikings solved some of their seafaring sanitation problems, not by fixing consequences after the fact, but by organizing their ships, their voyages, and their lives so the problems had nowhere convenient to grow. If you want to explore more about how ancient seafarers lived, sailed, and left traces in the archaeological record, check out our playlist on ancient seafaring and Norse archaeology.